Why is monopoly bad? Well, there are a couple of reasons why economists believe that monopolies in general should be discouraged in an economy. The first is that there's a loss to society from producing too little at too high a price, which remember is how we described monopolist behavior. This loss can be measured by a reduction in consumer and producer surplus known as the deadweight loss of monopoly. There's also a loss in the productive efficiency because the market does not produce at the bottom of the long run average cost curve. So let's go over both of these problems in detail. Okay, starting out with the loss of allocative efficiency. Remember, that's how efficiently the market allocates the good and service. Here again, we're using our concept of consumer surplus, which is the extra benefit that consumers get from purchasing the good above the price, which is the area between the demand curve and but above the price, and producer surplus, which is the amount the producer gets, the additional revenue they get from selling the good at a higher price than they would have been willing to accept. And that's measured by the area below the price but above the supply curve. The size of the combined consumer and producer surplus is a measure of the efficiency of a market. And the larger if the combination of consumer and surplus it is, the greater the value produced in the market. In general, if you impose a price or impose a quantity, excuse me, that's less than the market equilibrium quantity, notice you'll have a loss of consumer surplus and producer surplus. You'll have what's called a deadweight loss. And that's exactly what's happening in monopoly. There's something called the deadweight loss of monopoly. So here in this diagram, which is kind of complicated, and I'll try to walk you through it a little bit. Notice that a monopolist finds the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, which is QM, and then they go up to the demand curve and find PM, the price they're going to charge. If they behaved like a perfectly competitive firm, they would set price equals marginal cost, which means the intersection of marginal cost with the demand curve. So then they would be producing QC and charging price PC. Okay, so what's changed in terms of surplus between these two situations? If the monopolist were charging the competitive price, they would be earning a there would be surplus in the market. There would be consumer surplus that would be all the area above the price, the competitive price here, which I put in this dashed line. But by charging the price PM and producing QM, notice that two things happen. The first is that some of that surplus that consumers would have gotten is now transferred to the monopolist in the form of higher profits. Instead of getting PC, they're earning PM over the smaller quantity QM that they now produce. So some of the consumer surplus gets transferred to producers. Believe it or not, that's not the actual complaint that economists have about the situation. What their complaint is, notice what happens to producer and consumer surplus over here. Because we're producing a lower quantity, QM rather than QC, there's a loss of producer and consumer surplus right here. We tend to worry more about the consumer surplus because presumably the producers wouldn't be doing this if they didn't get more profit, extra profit from being charging the higher price, than their loss in producer surplus. But consumers do lose some value here. So there's a deadweight loss, this purple area, from producing too little at too high a price. That's the deadweight loss of monopoly, the extra value to the market that's been lost because of the way the monopolist earns their profits. Okay. The second reason why we believe that monopoly is quote unquote bad is that it usually does not achieve productive efficiency the way that the perfect competition always does in the long run. So let's look at the diagram in perfect competition. If you remember back from the first part of this week's lectures, when you in the long run, in perfect competition, all firms earn zero profits because anytime price gets high and there's supernormal profits, firms enter the industry and bid down the price from that high P2 to P1 until we get back to the bottom of the long run average total cost curve. So that means that in the long run, in a perfectly competitive market, we're always producing at the most efficient level. The quantity for each firm is exactly where they're at the bottom of their average total cost. Okay, in monopoly, remember, we're earning higher profits because we're charging P1 rather than the price, the equilibrium price, or the perfectly competitive price, which would have been where marginal cost equals intersects the demand curve. So the firm is earning supernormal profits, but there's no mechanism that would bring that back down to the bottom of the long run average total cost curve, because by definition, there's no entry in monopoly. So there's no mechanism guaranteeing that for a monopolist, they will end up producing at the most efficient level of output. Now, there are a few circumstances where monopoly is more efficient than if there were more firms in the market. The first case is something called natural monopoly. Remember that our long run average cost curve, if it's downward sloping, then we have economies of scale. And we should always try to produce more or have a firm produce more as long as there are economies of scale to expanding its output. Some industries have a particular production technology where the long run average cost curve is downward sloping over volumes of production that are sufficient to satisfy the entire market. Remember, we talked about how utilities fit into this category. You don't want to have two cable TV companies in a community or two electrical grids because it's more efficient to just have one, to have a monopolist. So in these circumstances, it's more efficient to have monopoly in the market than to have more firms competing with each other. Another situation where it's more efficient to have monopoly is in the case of patents. If we allow inventors to have a monopoly over their inventions, which is what a patent gives them, individuals and firms will then have the incentive to invest in research and development because they know they'll be earning supernormal profits. And because they have that incentive, they'll invest in research and create new technologies that can lead to economic growth. So these are situations where having just one firm in a market, either because there's a natural monopoly or because we've decided to legally create a monopoly to encourage investment in research. These are situations where monopoly is more efficient than if we had multiple firms entering these markets. However, usually in both the allocative and the productive sense, a monopoly is less efficient than other market structures.